tuning in to Planetterrian Daily, episode 120 for July 14th, 2026. Here's your science and health briefing. A newly mapped retinal commander cell coordinates separate visual pathways to detect faint details. Yale researchers identified a previously unknown cell type that integrates signals from distinct retinal circuits. Recordings showed coordinated firing patterns that improve overall visual sensitivity. The cell appears to boost detection of low-contrast features that individual pathways would miss. The team plans to map the cell's synaptic partners and test its contribution to visual behavior in vivo. Now, shifting to a very different area of research. Reduced phosphatidylcholine production in aging cells alters mitochondrial membrane composition and impairs respiration. This change appears upstream of other hallmarks such as fragmentation and reduced ATP output. Because the pathway is enzyme dependent, it offers a modifiable entry point rather than an irreversible endpoint. Researchers are now examining whether restoring synthesis rates in model systems reverses downstream mitochondrial defects. The phosphatidylcholine synthesis decline identified in aging cells sits at an early step in mitochondrial membrane remodeling. Restoring the lipid pathway in model systems could therefore test whether downstream fragmentation and respiratory loss are reversible. This work directly addresses the open question of which aging interventions translate across species by focusing on a measurable enzymatic step rather than broad senescence markers. The immediate next measurement is whether targeted lipid supplementation or enzyme activation improves mitochondrial function in older mammals. From mitochondrial membrane lipids to a distinct mechanical sensing circuit in the skin that also relies on precise cellular wiring. Most people assume any itch starts with histamine release or skin inflammation. In reality, a dedicated set of fine hairs and specialized nerve endings forms a separate mechanical itch pathway that operates without those signals. Right now, as you move your arm across fabric or feel a stray hair, that circuit is sampling light touch and deciding whether to trigger the scratch reflex. The system contains roughly 10 times more of these ultra-fine sensors per square centimeter than previously mapped itch fibers. Because the pathway can be silenced in animal models without affecting pain or ordinary touch, it supplies a precise target for chronic itch that does not respond to antihistamines. Watch for clinical trials that selectively block these neurons in eczema or neuropathic itch. From one newly mapped neural coordinator to another lipid pathway that coordinates mitochondrial function with age. The review explains that systemic antibodies alone leave the upper airway vulnerable to infection and onward spread. It describes how local IgA and tissue-resident T cells in the nasal mucosa can intercept viruses before replication begins. Current intramuscular vaccines generate limited nasal responses, prompting work on mucosal delivery platforms. Follow-up studies will test whether nasal-boosted regimens reduce household transmission rates. The review emphasizes that tissue-resident T cells must be engaged locally rather than through circulating responses alone. From local tissue immunity to how regular activity remodels autonomic control in another vital organ. The study demonstrates that regular activity alters the density and firing properties of nerves that control heart rate and rhythm. These neural changes occur alongside the well-known hypertrophic response in cardiomyocytes. The rewiring may explain why trained hearts show greater resilience to arrhythmias. Follow-up work will determine whether specific exercise intensities produce distinct innervation patterns. Measurements tracked both sympathetic and parasympathetic branches during progressive training protocols, from adaptive neural remodeling in the heart to a review that maps shared molecular drivers across clotting and inflammatory disorders. The review details how platelet factor 4 drives heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, vaccine-induced immune thrombotic thrombocytopenia, and other acute and chronic conditions. It outlines the protein's interactions with antibodies and cell surfaces that amplify both thrombotic and inflammatory responses. The authors map shared mechanisms across these disorders and note that targeting platelet factor 4 pathways could address multiple conditions at once. Next steps include testing whether existing anti-PF4 antibodies or new modulators alter disease progression in patients. The synthesis highlights how PF4 binds glycosaminoglycans on cell surfaces to nucleate immune complexes. Sampling before and after an unexpected typhoon showed sharp shifts in bacterial community structure within hours. Surface mixing redistributed nutrients and altered carbon and nitrogen fluxes measured during the cruise. The data capture how physical disturbance can reset microbial loops on short timescales. Continued monitoring will test whether repeated storms produce cumulative changes in coastal biogeochemistry. Post-typhoon samples revealed elevated nitrate levels paired with declines in certain photosynthetic bacterial groups. The proposal separates dark matter into heavier and lighter components that segregate over time inside galaxies. Heavier particles concentrate centrally while lighter ones migrate outward, producing both diffuse cores and dense substructures observed by astronomers. The single mechanism reproduces several discrepancies that single particle models leave unresolved. Next observations will search for predicted differences in rotation curves at varying galactic radii. Simulations indicate the lighter component could dominate velocity dispersion measurements at large radii. Transcription of numerical tables at Zultun reveals a personal name attached to lunar and planetary period calculations. The 1,200-year-old inscriptions link specific dates to monument erections and royal accessions. The discovery shows that mathematical astronomy was practiced by named individuals rather than anonymous scribes. Additional panels at the site are now being re-examined for further attributions. The calculations match known eclipse intervals recorded elsewhere in the Maya corpus. The Basai into Tuanukko surface maintains floating electrons for a week in air, overcoming prior instability of electrine materials. It catalyzes nitrogen reduction without the high temperatures and pressures of the Haber-Bosch process. Yield measurements confirm activity under ambient conditions. Scale-up tests will assess whether the material retains performance in continuous flow reactors. Doping levels were optimized to balance electron density with surface stability. The device uses a layered structure that routes heat flow around an interior volume without external distortion. It functions for both steady-state and transient temperature fields. Laboratory demonstrations confirmed concealment of test objects under infrared imaging. Potential uses include protecting electronics from localized heat sources and reducing thermal signatures. The cloak maintains performance across temperature gradients exceeding 50 degrees Celsius. A group of viruses infecting an agricultural bacterial pathogen showed no genetic change across 4 decades of sampling. The lack of rapid mutation suggests these phages could provide durable biocontrol agents. Field trials are planned to measure whether deliberate introduction reduces pathogen loads in crops. The finding also highlights how little is known about long-term phage ecology in farm settings. Archived strain collections from the 1980s were sequenced alongside recent isolates to establish the stability result. Data from the International Journal of Business Innovation and Research show that supervisor support correlates with higher output when workplace accommodations are already in place. The effect size varies with overall organizational climate. The study controlled for job type and tenure. Organizations are now testing structured supervisor training modules to replicate the gains. Responses were collected from more than 300 employees across multiple sectors. Modeling indicates that pairing new data centers with geological storage could capture over 90% of projected CO2 output. The analysis incorporates current grid mixes and projected compute growth. Cost curves suggest the approach becomes competitive once storage infrastructure scales. Regional deployment studies will identify sites where geology and power demand coincide. The model assumes continued improvements in capture efficiency at the point of emission. Results from the Open AdMet Challenge indicate that curated training sets yield better accuracy than simply enlarging neural networks. Top entries combine smaller architectures with cleaned experimental data on metabolism and solubility. The outcome shifts emphasis from scale to data stewardship in early-stage screening. Future rounds will test whether the same pattern holds for additional ADME endpoints. Several winning submissions used ensembles of gradient-boosted trees rather than deep networks. New findings on lipid metabolism, retinal wiring, and nerve remodeling continue to refine how cells and tissues maintain function over time. Keep an eye on follow-up measurements testing whether restoring phosphatidylcholine synthesis improves mitochondrial output in older mammals. That's Planetterrian Daily for today. If you enjoyed this, a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify really helps new listeners find the show. I'm Patrick in Vancouver. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you tomorrow. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NEJM Network. Links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the NEJM Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. First Principles Daily, reasoning from raw materials, not analogy, on the breakthroughs that actually cut cost. Find every show free at nejmnetwork.com. Live dashboards, TSLA, SpaceX launches, the investing scoreboard are all at nejmnetwork.com/data. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.